Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be explaining why shippers should take a new look at three benchmark rail rate cases. Due to changes in railroad revenues and the applicable cap on relief, these cases potentially offer improved opportunities today compared to a decade ago. My name is Jason Tutrone. I'm a partner at Thompson Hine. Joining me today are Jeff Moreno, Senior Counsel in our Transportation Practice, Tim Crowley, President at LE Peabody and Associates, and Rob Mulholland, Executive Vice President at LE Peabody and Associates. Jeff, our broader transportation team, and myself at Thompson Hine have extensive experience advising shippers on freight rail regulation. We have represented shippers in rate cases before the board. In fact, Jeff was part of the team that brought the first three benchmark cases at the STB. We have also represented shippers in other rate proceedings and shipper trade associations pursuing rate regulation reforms designed to make rate cases more accessible. Beyond rate cases, our freight rail practice advises shippers on a wide range of issues, including rail contracting, rail car leasing and acquisition, hazmat transportation, and derailments. Additionally, our transportation practice assists shippers with all freight modes, including trucking and ocean, and a wide range of logistics services. Tim and Rob, you want to provide some background on your work at Peabody?
Sure. Thanks, Jason, and thanks for having us today. My name is Tim Crowley, and I am president of LA Peabody and Associates. We are a national economic consulting firm with our main office in Alexandria, Virginia, and satellite offices in Tucson, Arizona, and a few other areas across the U.S. And while we are a national economic consulting firm, our focus or our core business is rail transportation. And we have participated in previous three benchmark maximum rate cases brought before the board, and also assisted numerous rail shippers negotiate transportation contracts with Class 1 and short line railroads using our proprietary market analyses, and as well as providing estimates of the maximum allowable transportation rates based on current STB procedures, including the three benchmark methodology, which is the focus of our discussion today. And I'm here with Rob Mulholland, my partner, who is also Executive Vice President of LE Peabody Associates.
And a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's program is being recorded. We will send you a link within the next few days. You're welcome to review it again at your leisure. This presentation is intended for the general information of individuals and organizations on matters of current interest. The thoughts and opinions expressed today are those of the individual panel members only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the panel members as clients, employers, affiliates, or Thompson Hine. The content should not be taken as advice, as the views expressed here are for informational purposes only. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located at the control panel on the right side of your screen. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar. And we strongly encourage you to please please submit your questions to us. We are happy to answer whatever questions you may have. In the handout panel, you will be able to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios of today's speakers. So again, thank you for your interest. If you have questions as we go along, again, please use the question box. We'll get to those questions at the end. So in today's webinar, we're going to start by talking about three benchmark cases, giving you an overview of what they are and how the board determines what a maximum reasonable rate is under the three benchmark methodology. We'll then go into talking about the improved outlook for three benchmark cases. And what has happened, what has changed over time that now shippers should take that new look at those cases. Then we'll explain how three benchmark cases can provide you as shippers with significant benefits, and we'll go over what those benefits are. And then finally, we will talk about how, as a shipper, you can then look into whether or not a three benchmark case might make sense for you. Do you meet the criteria to even qualify bring a 3 benchmark case before the Surface Transportation Board. And at the conclusion, we will answer questions that are submitted during the presentation. So starting off with rate cases, I think one of the best starting points is the Interstate Commerce Commission Termination Act and the requirement that rates for traffic over which a rail carrier has what they call market dominance. So there's a lack of effective competition. We'll talk about market dominance a little bit later. Rates over that traffic must be reasonable. And the board has a few ways in which it determines whether there are reasonable rates. One of those ways is the traditional approach is to bring what they call a standalone cost case, where a shipper develops a hypothetical new entrant rail carrier, and then based on that modeling, we determine what that new entrant rail carrier would need to charge to earn adequate revenues, and that helps form what the maximum rate should be. That type of proceeding can take 2 to 4 years. As you can imagine, developing a hypothetical carrier is a very involved process. And so when it comes to smaller disputes, that might not make sense. And because of that, the board has the 3 benchmark rate case, which is supposed to be a simpler, faster, and lower cost method to resolve smaller rate disputes. And as before I said, a SAC case can take 2 to 4 years. Well, a 3 benchmark case is supposed to be resolved within 240 days. You have a 150-day period where shippers and carriers are going to go through discovery. There's going to be mediation. The discovery is only 30 days. It's a limited discovery period. And then submit evidence to the board. The evidence is all submitted via paper briefs. And then after that 150-day period, the board then is supposed to or has set a target of 90 days for reaching a decision. Under a 3 benchmark case, there is a relief cap, which we don't have under a standalone cost case. That relief cap right now is $5.2 million over a 5-year period. That number does change and adjust with inflation. The board has a mechanism for adjusting that number. So next year, it will be a little bit different than this year, but we would expect it to go up. So simpler, faster. Now let's talk about how we get to that simplification, or at least that simpler approach, and that's through how the board looks at rate reasonableness and determines whether a rate is reasonable under 3 benchmark. In concept, what the board is doing with 3 benchmark is it's trying to set a maximum reasonable rate based on a comparable traffic. So you might have a shipment of, say, chlorine going from point A to point B. We're looking for comparable shipments to see what the rail carrier would charge that. And then those shipments, and then we adjust to reflect what the carrier's revenue adequacy. When we're talking about revenue adequacy, what we're talking about is the degree to which the carrier's revenues provide a rate of return equal to the industry cost of capital. What that basically means is it's a target which the board has set based on whether or not the railroad is likely to be able to earn an adequate return to attract investment and essentially maintain itself in a healthy financial manner. The board wants to allow, through the maximum rate process, it wants to allow for the railroads to still be able to continue to operate, as railroads do provide an important public benefit through transportation. So we want to make sure we protect the rail industry in that respect, because that's the policy. But at the same time, we recognize that railroads, shippers should be entitled to a rate that that does not, or that at least is limited by the railroad's revenue adequacy. So if it's more than what the railroad needs to be revenue adequate, then that's where your maximum rate your maximum limit comes in. And I'll turn it over to Tim to talk a little bit more about how the board takes this conceptual approach and puts it into action to determine what a maximum reasonable rate should be.
Sure. Rob, you want to lead off?
Sure. Yeah. This is Rob Mulholland, and we're going to talk a little bit now about the mechanics of how this works. In a three benchmark case, the maximum reasonable rate is developed by applying a revenue to variable cost, or RVC ratio, to the movement variable costs. And just before we jump into the formula, I'd like to just take just a second to discuss RVC generally. The R in RVC stands for revenue. And as the name implies, this is the total revenues, including the base rate, surcharges, and other rate adjustments for a given shipment. And the VC in RVC stands for variable cost. This is the variable cost incurred by the railroad to move the traffic. It's calculated using their STB's ERCS formula, where ERCS is an acronym that stands for Uniform Rail Costing System. So for a given move, the RVC ratio is simply the total revenues divided by the total variable cost incurred to move the shipment. So here in the first line of formula on this slide, we see we're applying the RVC ratio to the variable costs to determine the maximum lawful revenues for a shipment. So how do we determine what RVC ratio to apply? Well, that's where the three benchmarks come into play, the three benchmarks that give this method its name. The first benchmark is known as the RVC comp. The second is known as the RSAM, that RSAM, we colloquially call that RSAM. And the third benchmark is called RVC 180. Go to the next slide now. So here, let's break down these three VM variables one by one. As Jason was talking about, the RVC comp is the variable that reflects the RVC ratio for a group of other shipments on the railroad that is most comparable to the issue movement. This is based on traffic and operating characteristics. For example, the length of the shipment, the commodity being shipped, the type of equipment it's moving in, whether it's a 1 or 2 car shipment versus a unit train, whether it's moving in private or railroad equipment, what type of equipment, all the things that make a move, comparable in terms of the operating factors. This is developed using the board's confidential waybill data. That's the first part of the process when you enter into a rate case. Both parties get to opine as to what the comparable group of shipments should be based on all those parameters and their interpretation of what comparable moves would be to the particular shipment. And after both parties weigh in on what the group is, the board ultimately decides what the group will be. And then there's a specific statistical analysis that's done to determine that RVC ratio that represents the comparable shipments on the railroads. I'm going to skip to the bottom bullet now, just to facilitate this discussion. So we can calculate the RVC ratio for every move on a railroad. Rates that produce an RVC ratio less than 1.80 reflect a move where the revenues are less than or equal to 180% of the variable costs. In the board's framework, these moves are considered to be competitive shipments. Any move with an RVC ratio greater than 1.80 is assumed in the board's framework to be potentially captive. And so RVC 180 really is just the RVC ratio for this second group of shipments that are considered to be potentially captive on a given railroad. Moving back up to RSAM, RSAM stands for the Revenue Shortfall Allocation Method. And this is a methodology that's applied by the STB to each of the Class 1 railroads on an annual basis. For each railroad, the STB compares the railroad's total operating revenues to its total operating expenses, plus a return on investment equal to the industry cost of capital. If the board finds that the total revenues earned by the railroad are less than the total operating expenses plus return on investment, that differential is called the revenue shortfall. That is, the railroad theoretically did not generate adequate revenues during the subject year. So the RSAM methodology really, what it does is it determines what rate level would need to have been charged on the railroad's potentially captive shipments to eliminate that revenue shortfall. So in other words, it's the RVC ratio that, if it were applied to the railroad's potentially captive traffic, would make the railroad revenue adequate for the study year.
Rob, if I can just interject and add here, this is of these three benchmarks that you're looking at here. When it comes to rate case litigation, the RVC comp is where the litigation really occurs. And that's because both parties are arguing over what constitutes comparable traffic in order to generate the most favorable RVC comparisons. The RSAM and the RVC greater than 180 are given numbers. So we will always know those because the board provides those to us. This is part of what makes the three benchmark case a simpler methodology, because you're mostly arguing over the what constitutes comparable traffic.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to take us through how these two variables that are given. Next one. Oh, that was it. How these two variables that are given, the RSAM and the RVC 180, how they impact the RVC comp. RVC 180 represents the RVC ratio actually applied to the railroad's potentially captive traffic. It represents what the railroad actually charges its customers. RSAM is the RVC ratio required to achieve revenue adequacy according to the board's standards. It represents what the railroad theoretically needs to charge its customers. If RSAM is greater than RVC 180, a railroad theoretically needed to charge its customers more than it actually did in order to attain revenue adequacy for the study year. In this scenario, the RSAM over RVC 180 ratio, or the adjustment ratio, is greater than 1.0, indicating that the railroad should be allowed to increase rates so that it may eliminate its revenue shortfall. This results in an upward adjustment to the RVC comp variable in the three benchmark formula shown at the top of the slide. And this is the scenario we found ourselves in the last time three benchmark cases were brought before the board. All 7 Class 1 railroads were realizing an adjustment ratio greater than 1. It was an inflator to the RVC comp. In the opposite scenario, if the RVC 180 variable is greater than the RSAM, the railroad theoretically charged its customers more than it needed to in order to attain revenue adequacy for the study year. In this scenario, the adjustment ratio is less than 1.0, indicating that the railroad's rates can be reduced to the revenue adequacy equilibrium level. Here, there is no revenue shortfall. There is actually a revenue surplus, which results in a downward adjustment to the RVC comp variable in the three benchmark formula. And that's where we find ourselves today. That is what has changed in the industry, is those given values have resulted in 5 of the 7 Class 1 railroads realizing an adjustment ratio less than 1, which is a deflator to the RVC comp variable. Next slide, please. So here's an illustration of what I was just explaining, what has changed from 2010 to 2022, which is the latest variables available. As you can see in the column for 2010 under the adjustment ratio, all 7 Class 1 railroads realized a ratio greater than 1.0, which, as I stated before, means each railroad realized a revenue shortfall, which resulted in an upward adjustment to the RVC comp ratio. Conversely, in the 2022 column, you see that 5 of the 7 class 1s have an adjustment ratio less than 1.0, which means those railroads realize a revenue surplus and results in a decrease to the RBC comp ratio of the 3 benchmark formula for those 5 railroads only. And in the final column, you can see that what has changed from 10 to 22 is this ratio, this adjustment ratio of RSAM over RBC 180, it has decreased across the board, essentially demonstrating that now is a more favorable time to bring a 3 benchmark rate case, as that component of the formula is less than it was 12 years ago.
Tim, can you tell us why we're using 2022 data even though today's 2025?
Yeah, basically the short answer is 2023 is not available yet. It typically is released by the board in the February to April timeframe, and it has not been released yet. So I would estimate it'll be out sometime this month. We'll also see when 2023 is released that the CP and KCS lines here will be combined into one due to the CP KCS merger.
So as Tim was pointing out, back in 2010, we saw that adjustment ratio was above 1. And so that would have inflated that RBC comp value when you're producing that maximum reasonable rate. So that's going to result in a maximum reasonable rate level that's greater than that RBC comp level. Now, despite the higher adjustment ratios back in 2010, shippers did have some success with the initial 3 benchmark cases that they brought. In fact, with all the 3 benchmark cases that they brought. So there were 5 cases from 2009 to 2012. You had 3 cases brought at the same time by DuPont against CSX. The board initially found those rates were unreasonable, and then after that, the parties settled. You had a U.S. Magnesium case versus UP in 2010. There, U.S. Magnesium had a favorable outcome for the boards that the rates that UP was charging were unreasonable. And then there was a final 5th case in 2012 that led to a settlement. Now, despite shippers having success initially with these cases, what was apparent because of those high adjustment ratios was that the relief was really only available in your most extreme outlier cases. So this is where rates really were especially excessive, and that's for a few reasons. You had in 2012 the relief cap on rates was the relief cap under 3 benchmark was only $1 million. So even if so essentially there wasn't a lot that you could recover over that 5-year period. So many shippers might have seen that, even though they were being charged a high rate, they weren't going to gain all that much savings. So that was, one reason why I think shippers around 2012 started maybe to look elsewhere or not to put as much emphasis on 3 benchmark. And then again, as I was saying before, railroads weren't consistently revenue adequate at the time. So when shippers were looking at 3 benchmark cases, what they were seeing was that that inflator or that revenue adjustment factor was inflating that RBC comp number. And so the results really weren't quite as favorable as you might see today. And so that leads to, okay, what's changed over time? We were talking just now about increased revenue adequacy performance, and most Class 1 railroads by 2020 were consistently revenue adequate. So we saw that adjustment factor or adjustment ratio decrease. So now it's below 1. So now you're seeing that RBC comp value when we're calculating that maximum reasonable rate being deflated in some cases significantly, whereas before it was the opposite. Back in 2012, there was an inflation. And then we have a procedural change that also occurred. In 2015, the STB increased the relief cap from $1 million over 5 years to $4 million over 5 years with an inflation adjustment. So now, if the shipper is looking at a 3 benchmark case, there is a significantly larger amount that they might be able to recover than they otherwise may have thought back in the 2012 to 2015 timeframe. I'm trying to, Tim, just to give an example of what 3 benchmark might look like today.
Yeah. So you've heard a lot of words. Let's see how this actually would play out in a hypothetical example. For this hypothetical example, we're going to assume a 2022 movement on UP. We'll also assume the comparison group has an RBC of 3.0. Then this is the value that would be calculated using the STB waybill data. The two givens in this scenario are the actual values are the RSAM and the RBC 180. For 2022, UP had an RSAM value of 1.81 and an RBC 180 of 2.53. Those are actual values. That's not up for debate or is going to present evidence on that. In 2022, UP needed to apply an RBC of 1.81 on its potentially captive movements to achieve revenue adequacy. That's what the RSAM value is telling you. UP actually applied an RBC of 2.53 on its potentially captive movements and earned revenues in excess of the amount to be considered revenue adequate. That's what the RBC 180 value is telling you. As a result, UP charged its potentially captive shippers more than it needed to, producing an adjustment ratio of less than 1.0, which in this case is 0.72. You can see that on the second line there under the example. This deflator is applied to the RBC comp variable of 3.0, again, an assumed value, to arrive at a max RBC ratio of 2.16. This 2.16 RBC factor is then multiplied by the issue movement variable cost to arrive at the maximum reasonable rate. And I will just note here that other relevant factors is a consideration in a 3 benchmark rate case, but there is not a specific variable that can be quantified to address other relevant factors, so we have not attempted to include that here. There's no general definition or limit on what other relevant factors can encompass.
And I think it's worth noting, Tim, that the STB in only one case has ever adopted another relevant factor. The maximum rate applying the formula you have here has been used to actually set the rate in all the one STB case. And that one case was an outlier because there weren't enough comparable movement in the waybill sample to truly match the issue movement. Correct.
All right, so how can shippers use 3 benchmark in the current environment? One is, of course, trying to bringing a 3 benchmark case and obtaining a rate prescription or even reparations. So if you can look back 2 years, and if you were paying, and if the rate you were paying exceeds the maximum reasonable rate under 3 benchmark, you can get a reparation for what you had paid. And then looking forward, you can get a prescription for future rates. Again, it's going to be capped at that 5 million over 5 years. It's also inflation adjusted. But a rate prescription could result in a lower transportation rate than what you otherwise might expect. Additionally, I wouldn't just look at 3 benchmark from the perspective of a rate case. 3 benchmark and can be used, that methodology can be used to provide some leverage in negotiations. So if you can show the railroad that in a 3 benchmark case, you're likely to obtain a lower rate, that can help move the needle in your favor when trying to negotiate prices.
Yeah, Jason, I would just note here that at LA Peabody over the years, we have seen more success with our clients in negotiations using a preliminary 3 benchmark analysis that never even resulted in the need to bring it before the board. it was a positive negotiating tool, which is something that is possible to do here as well.
So that's how you can benefit from three benchmarking. And of course, the next question is going to be, do you qualify? Does three benchmark make sense based on, your shipments and your position? And the first thing to look at is the rate must be that we're talking about must be a tariff rate. If you're under contract with the railroad and you have a contract rate, that contract rate is not regulated. You have to be under a tariff rate only. So a tariff rate is a rate that the railroad will quote to you upon request, or a published rate in its tariffs. It's not a contract rate. So that's one of the first critical things to look at. If you have a tariff rate. Now, of course, you can always move off of contract at a certain period of time, and it's important, before you even get, if you're on a contract, before the contract comes up for termination and renewal, to look at three benchmark just to see, does it make sense at that point? If you were to move to a tariff rate, would you actually wind up with a rate that might even be better, and then bring a three benchmark case? Could you potentially wind up with a prescribed rate that's better than what you have under your current contract? In that case, you might want to move to a tariff rate. But the tariff rate is of course the first key thing to look for. The second is the type of traffic involved must not be what we call exempt traffic. There's certain traffic that the Surface Transportation Board has identified is going to be outside of its regulatory purview. So for example, intermodal shipments, container on flat car, trailer on flat car shipments, those shipments are exempt shipments. There are certain scrap commodities that are exempt, certain automotive commodities that are also exempt. So there are a variety of exemptions for certain types of commodities. So you're going to want to check whether you have exempt traffic involved. If it's exempt traffic, three benchmark just wouldn't apply. The third item is the carrier is going to have market dominance over the traffic. So as a prerequisite to obtaining any sort of rate prescription or rate reasonableness determination from the board, you have to show the board that the carrier has what we call market dominance. And there's two aspects to that. One is what we call quantitative market dominance. That's that RVC ratio that we were talking about before for your traffic. That has to be greater than 180%. So the revenues exceeding variable costs by 180%. Then there's a qualitative market dominance aspect. That means there cannot be any effective competition from other railroads or transportation modes for your traffic. If that's the case, the theory is that there is competition, and so competition should be sufficient to provide you with a competitive rate or a competitive constraint on rates. That's the theory behind the qualitative aspect of the market dominance review. In the past, market dominance, some folks may have viewed market dominance in rate cases and seen that it could be complex. The board has adopted a streamlined market dominance procedure within the past 5 years. And that streamlined market dominance approach for certain types of traffic can really simplify that market dominance showing. A fourth issue to look at is, what is your 5-year spend on the issue traffic? You have to remember there is a 5-year relief limit of about $5 million. And so you're going to want to look at your spend in relation to that relief limit. And then finally, and I'll let Tim speak to this a little bit more, you're going to want to do an analysis of what the potential RVC comp values are going to be.
Yeah, before Tim gets into that, I just want to say one thing about the 5-year spend on the issue traffic, make sure there's no confusion. When we say there is a $5.2 million relief cap today, that doesn't mean your 5-year spend is capped at $5.2 million. It means that the savings you get, the difference between the rate you challenged and the maximum rate that the three benchmark process produces, cumulatively, that differential multiplied by the number of carloads that you're shipping over 5 years cannot exceed $5.2 million.
And for this last component here, the RBC comp analysis, this is the variable that we discussed earlier, is calculated using the STB's confidential waybill data. You're calculating the RBC ratio of a comparable group compared to your issue traffic. And before pursuing a 3 benchmark rate case at the board, we would suggest doing a preliminary analysis using the public waybill data for this component. It would inform you not only if you have anything worth pursuing at the board, but ideally it could be used in negotiations with the railroad so that you would never even need to pursue a rate case.
Thanks, Tim. At this point, we'll take a look to see if there's any questions. If you have questions, feel free to submit them. We'll get some questions that we have some questions here. How can shippers, how certain can shippers be about potential outcomes in a 3 benchmark case if they cannot access confidential carload waybill samples? So I think earlier we mentioned something about the waybill sample being confidential, and that waybill sample is what gives folks access to what railroads are charging for comparable traffic. And so if that is a confidential sample, how can people get some clarity over what the potential outcome could be if they're going to do that analysis that you were just talking about on RBC comp?
Right. So the confidential waybill, or the public waybill, I should say, removes the confidential components of the waybill sample, specifically the revenues. And the carriers, correct, right? It's a more aggregated sample than the confidential one. So at the end of the day, we can use the public waybill to come up with estimates based on our experience and our knowledge of various lanes and markets to come up with a decent estimate of what revenues would be, and therefore the RBC comp would be, to help you with that certainty before you even pursue something before the board. And again, you might even end up not having to pursue anything at the board if a preliminary analysis could be used as a negotiating tool with the railroads.
One thing I think that's important for us to understand here is, why are we looking at this again? And those of you who have been in the world of the STB and rate case issues know that the STB has been searching for a alternative small rate case methodology for several years, and recently adopted a new methodology that it called final offer rate review. But the railroads appealed that new methodology, and the court overturned that earlier this year, or late last year rather. And that has left us back with 3 benchmark cases, which were the original small rate case standards. When we took a look at 3 benchmark cases again, however, we realized that what we have assumed in terms of results based on a decade ago is no longer true because of the change in revenue adequacy. And therefore, shippers are not left without an option for small rate cases. And we wanted to remind shippers that this option is out there, and it doesn't require that you bring a rate case to use it. It is also a potentially effective negotiation tool when it comes to the time to renegotiate your contract rates.
One more question that can come up on comparison groups and the comparison group analysis. when you're looking at a comparison group of traffic, one of the concerns that some shippers have had is, what if that comparison group is priced on the higher side? How does that impact my case? And I think it's important to recognize and go back to that slide where we showed the adjustment ratios. And what you can see is for many carriers, many of your class 1 carriers, and we'll try to get to that slide here, but
this one,
and even here for UP, I mean, UP is a good example. That adjustment ratio is down at 0.72, so that's a 38% decrease, excuse me, a 28% decrease to your RBC comp value. So that's a significant deflator that's going to be applied. When you look at, in 2010, what you're looking at for UP was an 11% increase. So it's important, when you're considering even looking at the comparison group and wondering, okay, what if the comparison group is on the high side? You're still looking at a potentially significant deflation of that comparison group, which could result in a maximum reasonable rate that still provides a substantial level of benefit to the shipper. So again, keep in mind that adjustment ratio. I think that's really critical here. That adjustment ratio has dropped significantly, and so now we're seeing that deflation, a significant deflation to that comp value.
I do have several questions that have come in now, Jason. Is the internal RBC calculated by the railroad and used by pricing managers as part of the discovery process? I think that's really how do you calculate the RBC ratio, I think.
The internal RBC meaning the IRC's RBC ratio?
Well, I don't know exactly what was meant by internal in the question, but I'm guessing there's a difference between how the railroad might calculate its variable costs and how the STV does. I think it really got an explanation as to how the RBC is calculated for purposes of 3 benchmark case.
Okay. So yeah, the variable cost component of the RBC ratio is based on the Uniform Rail Costing System, IRCS, and IRCS is based on system average costs. And yes, I would say they do differ from the internal railroad variable cost. Those do not come into play in a 3 benchmark case. Again, the 3 benchmark is supposed to be a simplified approach, and everything is basically given to you except for the comparable group. But within the comparable group, that variable cost is given in that for a specific move, the variables, the 9 variables, the 9 inputs into IRCS phase 3, those are all given. And so the variable cost is computed using the IRCS phase 3 program. And those variable costs compared to the revenues for each shipment in the comparable group, that's how the RBC ratios for the comp group is calculated.
Right, and I would just say that's like Tim was saying, there's 9 inputs. So you need to know some specific operational details about the move in question, what type of commodity, what type of equipment it's moving in, what railroad, and so forth. And now the STV's formula just is applied, and the answer is the answer. There used to be an opportunity for the parties to argue over whether or not movement-specific adjustments could be made or should be made. That's no longer in play, so it is a pretty straightforward calculation.
Next question is, how much might a shipper expect to spend on fees for a preliminary workup versus a case to completion?
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult to say specifically. I mean, obviously the preliminary workup would be much cheaper than a rate case because there's just more involved with a rate case. But I would say depending on if anybody's interested in getting a specific number, we would need to know specifics for your issue movement, and then we could give you an estimate for that. So just reach out to us as well. We can do that.
A lot of it would have to do with how many lanes you're talking about. Are you talking about one move or multiple? And then really where they're moving, because when we go to the public waybill to try to perform this analysis of what the comparable moves might be. It really sort of depends. There's a lot of I don't want to call it guesswork, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to from the public waybill to really zero in on which moves truly might be comparable and which might not, and what sort of adjustments need to be made. So it really is sort of a case-to-case question.
Next question is, if an exempt shipper can establish market dominance, can they use the 3 benchmark?
So if you're an exempt shipper, what we would need to do is remove the exemption related to your travel. And that's something I think, as we talked about, exempt commodities generally this would not apply to them. But you could remove the exemption for your particular traffic, and there may be reasons for that. Market dominance, likely, if you can show that the carrier does have market dominance, that would be definitely a factor that goes into whether or not you could remove that exemption. So as an exempt shipper, there are possibilities here. I wouldn't just wave off 3 benchmark. We want to look at, especially if the carrier's market dominance, whether we can remove that exemption.
Right, that's tied to commodity and sometimes equipment, and that list of exempt commodities has changed over the years. It has not just remained a one static list forever.
The next question is, how does the average cost for 3 benchmark case compare to a traditional rate case? I would say, first of all, that there is an it depends, but we can kind of give you the ballpark assessment here. And that is, the last 3 benchmark case was over a decade ago. And I think, having been involved in the DuPont cases, which were actually 3 benchmark cases all brought simultaneously, I think the total cost of those cases was, those 3 cases, was around $750,000. So if you divide them evenly by each of the cases, that would put it around $250,000 per case, about 15 years ago. Obviously, there are factors that change here, and one of the biggest variables in a 3 benchmark case pricing is the extent to which other relevant factors is litigated. If we were simply litigating the RBC comp, that's not terribly extensive because the STB uses a baseball style litigation to decide whether to accept the shipper's comparable group or the railroad's comparable group in their entirety. And that incentivizes both the shipper and the railroad to be fairly reasonable, because if they go far out of the ballpark, they risk their group being rejected entirely. When it comes to a large rate case, by comparison, it also depends on how large a case it is. If you look at the original single movement unit train coal cases, those might be litigated in the $3 to $4 million range. But if you get some very complex cases, like a lot of the chemical cases that were brought a decade ago, involving anywhere between 50 and 150 origin destination pairs, you could be talking upwards of $10 million to litigate some of those cases. But in either case, I think you're looking at 3 benchmark being a fraction of what a standalone cost type of case would be. Anyone else want to add to that? Or
no, I would agree. I think you summarized that well.
Right, and I think that was also one of the reasons why the board revisited the original limit on the on the relief available, is that there was an acknowledgement on their part that these things, while they're simple, they still cost money. And in the case of DuPont, $750,000 eats up a lot of the $1 million relief pretty quickly.
We just have one other question so far in the queue, and that is there any other mechanism for the STB to limit excess rate charges on shippers besides bringing a rate case? If they have this data showing the ratios have moved outside of acceptable boundaries, why don't they act in a broad manner on all railroad activities? That's a very astute policy question, I think, more than anything else.
We get the board on the line?
Yeah, can we get that? But I don't, the short answer is no. There are no other means for addressing unfavorable rates. And the main reason why is because Congress restricted the STB's jurisdiction, or I should say originally the ICC's jurisdiction in the 1980 Staggered Rail Act. There has to be this market dominance, and the railroads are given the freedom to price their traffic at whatever level they want, subject to a rate complaint under reasonableness. So the STB can't simply set guideposts and say, if you go outside of these boundaries, your rate's unreasonable. They can only act upon a complaint by a shipper applying specific standards, including standards that are focused on maintaining revenue adequacy of the rail industry.
All right, well, we went a few minutes over because we wanted to make sure to answer your questions. Thank you for your interest in attending today's webinar. As a reminder, today's program was recorded. We will send a link to you within the next few days. We urge you to consider looking at 3 benchmark cases. You can see from this slide that deflator, or the adjustment ratio now is showing a significant deflation in many cases. And so that shows an improved opportunity for these types of cases. If you're not currently, before we leave, if you're not currently receiving our updates and invitations, we invite you to go to the Thompson Hine website and register to receive our mailings under the publications tab. Thank you all again for your interest in attending today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.